Billionaire's wife was about to sign bankruptcy papers when poor driver spotted a $300 million mistake. This is a story about the moment before a choice becomes permanent. This is about what happens when someone who has nothing to gain decides that silence costs more than speaking. I've spent years watching how decisions get made in rooms where only certain voices are expected to matter. What stays with me from this story isn't the money or the boardroom drama. It's how close everything came to ending because everyone assumed the wrong person couldn't possibly be right. So here is the question I keep returning to, the one I hope you'll carry with you as this unfolds. If we only trust expertise that comes with credentials, whose knowledge are we teaching ourselves to ignore? I don't have answers that satisfy me completely. What's at risk here isn't just money, though the numbers are staggering. The conference room on the 32nd floor of the Embarcadero Center was designed to make difficult decisions feel inevitable. Margot Calder sat at the head of that table on a Tuesday morning in March, holding a pen that had belonged to her husband. It was a Mont Blanc, the barrel worn smooth from decades of contracts, acquisitions, expansions. He had signed their marriage certificate with it. He had signed the deed to their first house. And now she was supposed to use it to sign away the company he had built from a single cargo route into an empire that moved goods across the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. The document in front of her was over 200 pages, but the critical signature line was on page 8. Voluntary bankruptcy filing. Chapter 11 Reorganization. The language was clinical, designed to obscure what it actually meant. Calder Maritime would cease to exist as her husband had built it. Assets would be liquidated. Creditors would be paid fractions of what they were owed. Employees would lose pensions. And the family name, synonymous with reliability for 4 decades, would become a case study in mismanagement. She had been told this was the only option. The restructuring consultant, a woman named Diane Forster who commanded $1,500 an hour, had laid it out 3 weeks earlier with the kind of clarity that felt like compassion but was really just efficiency. The company was overleveraged. The debt-to-asset ratio was unsustainable. The market had shifted. Fuel costs had spiked. Insurance premiums had doubled after damaged 3 vessels in the South China Sea. The numbers didn't lie, Diane had said, and the numbers said bankruptcy was the least destructive path forward. Margot's husband wasn't there to disagree. Charles Calder had suffered a heart attack 6 months earlier, severe enough that his cardiologist forbade him from returning to work. He was home now in their house in Pacific Heights, monitored by nurses, forbidden from stress. Margot had taken over not because she wanted to, but because there was no one else. Their children were grown and scattered. One was a professor of literature in Boston, the other ran a nonprofit in Nairobi. Neither had interest in shipping logistics. So the weight fell to her. And it was heavy. The attorney sitting to her left, Gerald Moss, a partner at one of the city's oldest firms, cleared his throat softly. Not impatient. Just a reminder that the documents had been reviewed, that the board had voted, that delay only increased liability. Margot looked at the signature line. Her hand was steady. She had cried the night before, alone in the study, looking at photos of Charles cutting ribbons at terminal openings, shaking hands with port authorities, standing on the bridge of the flagship vessel. But she was done crying now. This was just a formality. A painful, necessary formality. She brought the pen to the paper. That's when Elias Rowan spoke. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you are watching from. Is it London or Great Britain? We want to know, and if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. He was standing near the door as he had been for the past 40 minutes, hands folded, posture straight. Elias had worked for the Calders for nearly 18 years. He drove Charles to meetings, picked Margot up from charity events, waited in parking garages and hotel driveways and airport terminals. He was 53 years old, lean, with the kind of face that didn't demand attention. His hair was graying at the temples. His suit was off the rack but well maintained. He had grown up in Oakland, the son of a dock worker, and he understood the industry in the way people do when they've lived adjacent to it their entire lives. He wasn't supposed to speak, but he did. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm enough to carry. "Please don't sign that yet." The room stilled. Gerald Moss turned, his expression somewhere between confusion and irritation. Diane Forster looked up from her tablet, eyebrows raised. The CFO, a man named Kenneth Pruitt who had been with Calder Maritime for 9 years, set down his coffee cup carefully, his jaw tightening. Margot blinked, the pen still hovering. "Elias." He took a breath. He had rehearsed this moment in his head for days, knowing it might cost him his job, knowing it might make him look foolish. But he had also spent those days unable to sleep, replaying the conversation he had overheard, the documents he had glimpsed, the numbers that hadn't made sense. I drove your husband to the Oakland terminal last December, Elias said. The night before the refinancing on the fourth vessel was finalized. Kenneth Pruitt's face went very still. Elias continued. I'm not a financial expert. I didn't go to business school. But I grew up around shipping manifests. My father worked the docks for 30 years. I know how to read a bill of lading. And I know when numbers don't match the story they're supposed to tell. Diane Forster leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but watchful. Mr. Rowan, this is a complex financial situation. With respect, unless you have specific information. I do, Elias said. The room changed. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. The air felt thicker. Margot set the pen down. What did you see? Elias swallowed. The valuation assumes that the Pacific Rim contracts default if Calder Maritime files for bankruptcy. That's the basis for the restructuring. Without those contracts, the company isn't viable. But those contracts won't default. Kenneth Pruitt spoke quickly, too quickly. That's not accurate. Elias met his eyes. They won't default because they're insured separately. Through a subsidiary. A shell company that isn't listed in the bankruptcy filing. Silence. Gerald Moss frowned. Which subsidiary? Elias hesitated. He knew this was the moment he crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Pacific Cascade Holdings. It was registered in Delaware 3 years ago. Same ownership structure. Same management. But it holds the insurance policies and the revenue streams for the Asian routes. If Calder Maritime goes under, Pacific Cascade doesn't. It keeps operating. Same ships. Same ports. Different name. Diane Forster's eyes narrowed. How do you know this? Elias's voice was steady. I wait in cars. I stand in hallways. People talk when they don't think anyone's listening. And I saw the paperwork. Last winter. In the backseat after a meeting in Oakland. Mr. Pruitt was on a call. The folder was open. Kenneth Pruitt stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're accusing me of. I'm not accusing anyone, Elias said, his tone still calm. I'm saying the bankruptcy filing is based on an incomplete picture. And if that's true, Mrs. Calder deserves to know before she signs. Margot looked at Kenneth. Then at Gerald. Then at Diane. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Gerald Moss closed his folder. I think we need to pause. The meeting ended without a signature. Margot asked for 48 hours. Gerald Moss agreed, though his discomfort was obvious. Diane Forster left without comment, her tablet tucked under her arm. Kenneth Pruitt remained behind, his face flushed, insisting that Elias had misunderstood what he saw, that the shell company was a routine tax structure, that nothing about the filing was improper. But Margot had seen his eyes when Elias spoke, and she couldn't unsee it. That evening, she sat in the study with a glass of wine she didn't drink and a stack of documents she couldn't parse. Charles was asleep upstairs, sedated by medication that kept his heart rate steady. She wanted to wake him to ask him if he had known about Pacific Cascade Holdings, if it had been his idea or Kenneth's, if it mattered. But the doctor had been clear. No stress, no business talk, no decisions that might trigger another cardiac event. So she was alone with the numbers. And they were enormous. Calder Maritime's stated debts exceeded $300 million. The assets, ships, terminals, warehouses, contracts, were valued at just under $280 million, assuming the Pacific contracts defaulted. That $20 million gap was the justification for bankruptcy. Without it, creditors couldn't be paid in full. The company would collapse under its own obligations. But if Elias was right, if the Pacific contracts didn't default because they were protected under a separate entity, then the asset valuation was wrong. Potentially very wrong. Margot called her son that night. He was a literature professor, not a businessman, but he was careful and thoughtful, and she needed someone to talk to who didn't have a financial stake in the outcome. Do you trust him? Her son asked, meaning Elias. I do, Margot said. But I don't know if that's enough. Then find out if he's right. It sounded simple. It wasn't. The next morning, Margot hired an independent auditor, a firm that had no prior relationship with Calder Maritime, no loyalty to the board, no reason to protect anyone. She told Gerald Moss she wanted a full review of all subsidiaries, all holdings, all insurance structures. She expected resistance. She got it. Kenneth Pruitt called her directly, his voice tight with controlled anger. Margot, this is a mistake. You're listening to a driver who doesn't understand corporate finance. This is going to cost time we don't have and money we can't spare. Then it won't take long to prove him wrong, Margot replied. Kenneth was silent for a moment. Then, You're putting the entire restructuring at risk. Good, Margot said and hung up. The pushback intensified. Two board members called to express concern about her judgment. One suggested, gently, that the stress of Charles's illness was affecting her decision-making. Another reminded her that bankruptcy, while painful, was a standard business tool. Nothing shameful, nothing unusual. Delaying it, he said, only made things worse for everyone. An email arrived from an anonymous account, short and pointed. Listening to staff over experts is how amateurs lose everything. Margot deleted it. But it stayed with her. Because part of her wondered if they were right. Elias was a driver. A good man, a loyal employee, someone she trusted personally, but was that enough? Did he really understand the complexities of international shipping finance? Or had he seen something that looked wrong but wasn't, misinterpreted something routine as sinister? She didn't know. And the not knowing felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. Meanwhile, Elias faced his own consequences. The day after the meeting, his security badge stopped working. When he arrived at the Calder building to pick up Margot for a meeting, the lobby guard told him his access had been revoked. No explanation. Just a polite, scripted apology. He called the head of operations. No answer. He called HR. They told him they'd look into it. By the afternoon, he received an email reassigning him to a different client, a tech executive in Palo Alto who needed a driver 3 days a week. The pay was the same, but the message was clear. He was being moved away from the Calders. Elias didn't fight it. He had expected this. Maybe even accepted it. He had spoken up knowing it might cost him his position, his proximity to a family he had come to care about. But he had also spent 18 years watching how decisions got made, and he knew that silence in certain moments was its own kind of betrayal. So he drove to Palo Alto and waited in parking lots and said nothing. But Margot noticed. When she asked why Elias wasn't driving her anymore, she was told it was a scheduling issue. When she pressed, she was told it was for his own protection, that given the sensitive nature of the bankruptcy proceedings, it was better to limit his access to confidential discussions. She didn't believe it. But she was also in the middle of a fight she wasn't sure she could win. The independent audit took 9 days. 9 days during which Margot slept poorly, ate little, and avoided the hospital where Charles was recovering because she didn't want to lie to him about what was happening. 9 days during which the board grew restless, creditors grew impatient, and the press began circling with rumors of instability. And then the auditors delivered their report. It was 63 pages long. Margot read it alone in the study with the door locked. The summary was on page 2. Pacific Cascade Holdings was not a routine tax structure. It was a deliberate separation designed to isolate the most profitable contracts from the parent company. If Calder Maritime filed for bankruptcy, those contracts would continue generating revenue, but that revenue would flow to Pacific Cascade, not to creditors. The ships would keep sailing. The ports would keep operating. The clients would keep paying. But the debts would disappear. And the people who controlled Pacific Cascade, Kenneth Pruitt and 2 other executives, would effectively own the profitable core of the business without the liabilities. It wasn't illegal. It was structured carefully, using established corporate tools, documented in filings that were technically public but buried in subsidiary disclosures that no one without expertise would think to examine. But it was a betrayal. Margot sat with the report for a long time, watching the fog roll in over the bay, thinking about all the meetings where Kenneth had looked her in the eye and told her there was no other option. All the times he had reassured her that bankruptcy was the responsible choice, the ethical choice, the only way to protect what remained. He had been lying. Not explicitly. Not in ways that could be prosecuted. But lying nonetheless. She called Gerald Moss. "I need you to stop the filing," she said. There was a pause. "Margot, if the audit found something..." "It did." Another pause longer. "Then we need to meet. Immediately. If you are still watching, comment I'm still here. So we will know who is riding this out with us." The second meeting was smaller. Just Margot, Gerald Moss, the lead auditor, and a litigator Gerald brought in from his firm's white-collar defense team. Kenneth Pruitt was not invited. Neither was Diane Forster. The board was informed only that the filing was on hold pending additional review. The litigator, a woman named Sarah Chin who had spent a decade prosecuting corporate fraud before moving into private practice, laid it out with clinical precision. "What they did isn't criminal," she said. "But it's actionable. You can challenge the bankruptcy filing on the grounds that the valuation was deliberately misleading. You can sue the executives personally for breach of fiduciary duty. And you can restructure the company in a way that brings Pacific Cascade back under the parent umbrella." Will it work? Margot asked. Depends on how hard they fight. And how much you're willing to spend. Margot looked at Gerald. What do you think? He removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly. I think you have to decide what you're fighting for. If it's the company, you can probably save it. If it's justice, that's harder to guarantee. What's the difference? The company can survive this. But it won't be the same. You'll lose board members. You'll lose relationships. People will say you're paranoid, vindictive, that you destroyed trust over a misunderstanding. And even if you win, the industry will remember the fight, not the outcome. Margot was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered. What happens to the employees if I don't fight? Sarah Chin didn't hesitate. They lose their pensions. The bankruptcy filing wipes out the pension fund as an unsecured creditor. Pacific Cascade has no obligation to honor those commitments. Margot closed her eyes. She thought about the dock workers in Oakland, the logistics coordinators in Long Beach, the maintenance crews in Seattle. People who had spent decades with Calder Maritime, who had believed the company would take care of them, who had planned retirements around promises that were about to evaporate. She thought about Elias, who had risked his job to tell her the truth. And she thought about her husband, who had once told her that a company was only as good as the people who trusted it. File the challenge, she said. The fallout was immediate. Kenneth Pruitt resigned within hours of being informed. He released a statement through his attorney calling the accusations baseless and defamatory, insisting that Pacific Cascade was a legitimate restructuring tool approved by legal counsel. He threatened to sue for wrongful termination. Margot's attorney advised her to settle. She refused. 2 other executives followed Kenneth out the door. One board member resigned in protest, calling Margot's actions reckless. Another stayed but stopped returning her calls. The press coverage was brutal. Business journals ran stories about dysfunction at Calder Maritime, quoting anonymous sources who described Margot as emotional, inexperienced, unable to handle the pressure of leadership. One article suggested she was being manipulated by outsiders with grudges against the executive team. Another called the audit a witch hunt. Margot stopped reading. But the damage was done. Clients grew nervous. 2 contracts were quietly moved to competitors. A bank that had been negotiating a credit extension withdrew its offer. The stock price, already low, dropped another 15%. And through it all, Margot kept working. She brought in a new CFO, a woman who had spent 20 years in shipping finance and had a reputation for meticulous honesty. She restructured the board, replacing loyalists with independents who had no ties to Kenneth or his allies. She renegotiated contracts, sold non-essential assets, and brought Pacific Cascade back under the parent company's umbrella. Took 8 months. 8 months of 16-hour days of legal battles and press conferences and tense meetings with creditors who wanted guarantees she couldn't give. 8 months of watching her husband recover slowly, asking her how things were going, and her smiling and saying everything was fine because the truth would have put him back in the hospital. But at the end of those 8 months, Calder Maritime was still standing. Smaller. Humbler. No longer an empire. But solvent. The pension fund was protected. The employees kept their jobs. The ships kept sailing. And Margot learned something about leadership that no business school teaches. That the hardest decisions are the ones where you can't see the outcome, where expertise tells you one thing and instinct tells you another, and you have to choose anyway. She also learned something about gratitude. When the restructuring was finalized, she called Elias. He had been working for the tech executive in Palo Alto, driving in silence, staying invisible. He didn't expect to hear from her. I owe you an apology, Margot said. Elias was confused. For what? For not protecting you. For letting them push you out. You were fighting for the company, Elias said. I understood. I want you to come back. And I want to offer you a settlement. For what you did. For what it cost you. There was a long silence. Then Elias said quietly, I don't need a settlement, Mrs. Calder. I didn't speak up for money. Then what do you need? Another pause. I need to know it mattered. Margot's throat tightened. It did. More than you know. Then that's enough. But Margot wasn't done. She reinstated him as the family's driver. She also created a position, an advisory role, informal but real, where Elias could flag concerns he noticed, things that didn't add up, patterns that seemed wrong. She called it operational oversight. Elias called it common sense. And when a journalist asked her months later why she had trusted a driver over a CFO with an MBA and a decade of experience, Margot didn't hesitate. My husband used to say that God hides wisdom where pride won't look, she replied. I didn't understand what he meant until I almost signed away everything he built because I assumed the people with credentials must be right. The journalist pressed. So you're saying expertise doesn't matter? No, Margot said. I'm saying expertise without integrity is just polished deception. And sometimes the person who sees the truth is the one no one expects to be paying attention. So here's what stays with me. Not the money, though the numbers were staggering. $300 million in assets nearly lost because of $20 million in deliberate miscalculation. Not the drama, though there was plenty, resignations, lawsuits, press coverage that painted Margot as everything from a hero to a paranoid amateur. What stays with me is the moment before the pen touched the paper. That suspended instant when Elias Rowan, a man whose job was to be invisible, decided that silence was more expensive than speaking. When he calculated the cost, his livelihood, his access, his safety, and decided the truth mattered more. I keep thinking about what that required. Not courage in the abstract Hollywood sense, but the specific, unglamorous courage of knowing you'll be dismissed, knowing you'll be resented, knowing you might be wrong, and speaking anyway because the alternative is watching someone make a decision based on incomplete information. Elias wasn't a whistleblower in the traditional sense. He wasn't exposing a crime. He wasn't protected by law or policy. He was simply a man who had spent decades in proximity to power, who had learned to read the spaces between what people said and what they meant, and who had seen enough to know when something was being hidden. And he spoke up. Not to a regulator. Not to the press. But directly to the person whose signature would make the deception permanent. That's a different kind of intervention. It's personal. It's immediate. It's the kind of thing that can't be undone once it's said. And it worked not because Elias had authority, but because Margot was willing to listen. That's the other part that stays with me. Margot Calder had every reason to ignore him. She was exhausted, grieving, surrounded by experts who had spent weeks telling her there was no alternative. She was operating in a world where credentials matter, where hierarchy is assumed to correlate with competence, where a driver's observation would normally be dismissed as confusion about things he couldn't possibly understand. But she paused. She didn't immediately agree with him. She didn't fire Kenneth on the spot or halt the bankruptcy out of faith in Elias's instincts. She did something harder. She took the question seriously enough to investigate. She created space for the possibility that the people she trusted might be wrong, that the systems designed to protect her might be failing, that truth might come from an unexpected direction. And that willingness, to remain uncertain, to delay a decision everyone was pressuring her to make, to risk looking foolish in order to be sure, that's what saved the company. Not heroism. Not brilliance. Just the humility to admit she didn't know everything. I think about how rare that is. How often we hear about institutions failing not because the truth was hidden, but because it was spoken by someone whose voice didn't carry weight. How many times warnings are dismissed because they come from the wrong level of the hierarchy, the wrong department, the wrong side of the credibility gap. Elias's father worked the docks. Elias drove cars. Neither role requires an MBA. Neither comes with a business card that commands respect in a boardroom. And yet Elias understood something the CFO and the restructuring consultant either missed or chose to obscure, that numbers can be arranged to tell a story, and the story being told about Calder Maritime's insolvency was incomplete. He saw it because his job required him to be present but unnoticed, to hear conversations people didn't realize they were having out loud, to read documents left open on back seats because no one thought the driver was literate in the language of corporate finance. And he was right. Not partially right. Not right in spirit but wrong in detail. Fully, documentably, $300 million right. That's a hard thing to sit with if you're someone who believes competence follows credentials. Because it suggests that expertise, while valuable, can also be a shield, a way of dismissing inconvenient observations by questioning the observer's qualifications rather than investigating the observation itself. Kenneth Pruitt wasn't a villain in the simple sense. He didn't set out to destroy Calder Maritime. He structured a deal that, from his perspective, probably felt smart, strategic, even defensible. He protected the profitable core of the business. He used legal tools designed for exactly this purpose. He may have even believed he was helping, that bankruptcy would allow the company to shed unsustainable obligations and emerge stronger. But he did it in a way that transferred risk onto people who had no say in the decision. The dockworkers, the logistics staff, the employees whose pensions were classified as unsecured debt and would have vanished in the restructuring. And he did it without telling Margot the full picture. That's not illegal. But it's a betrayal of the kind that's harder to prosecute because it lives in the space between what's permitted and what's right. I don't know if Kenneth understands that. I suspect he sees himself as a scapegoat, A competent executive punished for making hard choices by a woman who let emotion override business sense. I suspect he believes the audit was an overreaction, that the settlement he eventually paid was extortion, that Margot damaged the company more by fighting him than she would have by signing the papers and moving on. And maybe from his perspective that's true. But perspective isn't the same as truth. The truth is that the bankruptcy filing was based on a valuation that concealed assets. The truth is that employees would have lost their pensions while executives retained control of the profitable contracts. The truth is that Elias saw it, named it, and refused to stay silent even when silence was expected. And the truth is that Margot listened. Which brings me back to the questions I asked at the beginning. When does loyalty to truth override loyalty to position? I think the answer is simpler than we make it. It overrides when the position requires you to participate in something you know is wrong. Not ambiguous. Not debatable. Wrong in the sense that it harms people who trusted you, who built their futures on promises your silence will break. Elias didn't owe the Calders perfect loyalty. He wasn't family. He was an employee, and employees are allowed to prioritize their own security. But he also wasn't a bystander. He had information that mattered, and he had access to the person who could act on it. So he spoke. Not because it was safe. Because it was necessary. And the second question, if we only trust expertise that comes with credentials, whose knowledge are we teaching ourselves to ignore? I think about this one a lot. Because the world Elias grew up in, the docks, the freight yards, the blue-collar logistics networks that move goods across the planet, that world runs on knowledge that doesn't come from business schools. It's knowledge built from repetition, observation, pattern recognition. It's knowing what a manifest should look like because you've seen 10,000 of them. It's noticing when a contract doesn't match the route because you've driven that route enough times to know which ships go where. It's not formal. It's not certified. But it's real. And when we dismiss it, when we treat it as less legitimate because it wasn't taught in a classroom or summarized in a consulting report, we create blind spots that people like Kenneth Pruitt can exploit. Not because they're smarter. Because they know we won't question them. Elias disrupted that assumption. He stood in a room full of people whose education and income and social position vastly exceeded his, and he said, "You're wrong." And he was right. That doesn't mean every employee who questions a decision is correct. It doesn't mean expertise is irrelevant or that credentials are meaningless. But it does mean that truth doesn't always arrive in the packaging we're trained to respect. Sometimes it shows up in a driver's quiet voice, in the middle of a meeting, at the moment when a signature is about to make a lie permanent. And what we do in that moment, whether we listen or dismiss, investigate or ignore, that's the choice that defines us. Margot chose to listen. It cost her relationships. It cost her reputation, at least temporarily. It cost her months of brutal work to rebuild what the fight had damaged. But it saved the company. More importantly, it saved the people who depended on the company. The workers who would have lost their pensions. The families who would have lost their stability. The community that would have absorbed the fallout of another corporate bankruptcy that enriched executives while devastating everyone else. That's not a small thing. And it happened because a driver paid attention and a woman in power was humble enough to admit she might not have the full picture. I don't know if that's a happy ending. Calder Maritime survived, but it's smaller now. Less profitable. Less prestigious. Margot aged in those 8 months in ways that had nothing to do with time. Elias went back to driving, to waiting, to being the person executives forget the moment they exit the car. Nothing dramatic changed. No one wrote a book about it. No documentary crew showed up to celebrate the vindication. Life just continued, quieter and truer than it would have been if the signature had fallen. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the point isn't transformation in the Hollywood sense. The triumphant music, the tearful reconciliation, the lesson learned and shouted from the rooftops. Maybe the point is just this. That in a world where power often mistakes confidence for correctness, where complexity is used to obscure rather than illuminate, where the people closest to the work are assumed to know the least about it. In that world, it still matters when someone speaks up. And it still matters when someone listens. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you're in a meeting where a decision is being made, where consensus has formed, where the experts have spoken and the path forward seems clear, pay attention to who isn't speaking. Not because they don't have anything to say, but because they've learned that saying it comes at a cost. And ask yourself, what might I be missing because I'm not listening to the person I've trained myself to ignore? It's not a comfortable question. But it's the one Margot Calder asked herself in the moment before the pen touched paper. And it's the reason Calder Maritime still exists. Not because she was smarter than the people advising her, but because she was willing to admit she might not be. That willingness, To pause, to question, to listen to someone whose authority comes from attention rather than credentials. That's not weakness. It's the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up in the space between what we're told is inevitable and what turns out to be true. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it's the kind that saves us from signing away something we can't afford to lose. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and hit that notification button so you won't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.